there was a census in 1920 that a book was published with the data for every census tract in New York City, and it had some very interesting information like where people were born and gender and age, where their parents were from. Although I'd been studying places like New York and neighborhoods in New York for a long time, that this was an opportunity to see where did those neighborhoods come from, right? What were they before? I went on to do a project for 1880. We chose 39 cities and created maps of those cities based on the street grid at that time, and then placed people on the map in the location of their home. Now, the most interesting thing about that is the possibility of being able to study how neighborhoods are changing. The big question for me is how we draw boundaries between groups. And the boundary between blacks and whites in the United States is the outstanding one. And the question there is, after ghettos formed in major northern and midwestern cities in the 1920s, 1930s, how did they stay so persistent over time? And why is it that even today, the average African American lives in a very disproportionately minority neighborhood, and their children go to very disproportionately minority schools? Why is that boundary so strong? And we have to deal with the question of to what extent are people actually choosing, like, I have a preference to live among people like me, and I don't care if it means bad schools and high crime. But people are quite surprised to know that very affluent African Americans live in poorer neighborhoods than working class whites, because Americans want to believe that class solves everything. On the other end, with African Americans, what has surprised me is how early this process took shape. I've looked at New York and Chicago in great detail for that period, and I find that even at that time when the cities were not more than 1 or 1.5% black, you'll see that they were very highly segregated. African Americans lived in buildings that were 95% black, and mostly they were next door to another black building. But the block might be pretty mixed. So I think of that as the origins of ghettoization for African Americans. But it shows that the social boundary was there in place, very strong, even just a little bit after the Civil War. So I want to understand that. I want to understand the origins of black neighborhoods and then watch their transformation. For other groups, the question is how people come in and then move on in American society. There's a great deal of mobility, and it's partly because they improved their class position. But I think it's also partly because, as one historian put it, they became white. And there is a process of becoming white for ethnic groups in America, but the barrier is very strong. I'd been led to believe by the literature that there was an assimilation process that was pretty aggressive and that was pulling people in. By the second generation, they weren't speaking the mother tongue anymore. They were thinking like Americans. They were moving out of the neighborhood. And what I've discovered is that while there was that process, it's over a much longer time frame. It's not 20 years or 30 years, but it's 60 or 80 or 100 years is the time frame in which group boundaries become less of a barrier for people's opportunities. There are issues that need to be better understood and patterns that persist that a lot of people thought have gone away. And so the question is, how does a sociologist, a demographer, get questions into the public eye? There's a lot of people and a lot of organizations who can be empowered with information and are capable of using it. So I'm working with these data, and my job is to put them out there, draw the conclusions I can draw, identify patterns that I can identify, and then hope that other people with other skills will then use it and go further beyond what I can do.